Hello, everyone. Thanks for staying with us. This is going to be the final session of today's summit before we do a bit of an editorial debrief, and you'll see Giles come back for that in a minute. And we're trying something a little bit different here from other summits. Something we're really passionate about at Tortoise is using the network of young people. It's why we offer free student membership. It's why we have our network that supports organisations, not just for young people, but in the main young people to kind of join Tortoise and have their voices heard. So we're trying something here. This is going to be a rapid fire session. It's only 30 minutes. And we want to hear from some amazing young leaders about their views about what leaders should be doing. That's the key point here. And I think that we have some amazing speakers who are joining us today. I'm really, really excited. So we've got Juja Mamri, who's the UK climate delegate to the 2021 G7 Youth Summit, which you should really keep your eyes on. We've also got Vishal Prasad, who's a campaigner, who's coming to us, I think, from Fiji, which is also incredibly exciting. And I know that there's some other people who may be joining from around the world. And kind of something that I've been thinking about since this morning's sessions with Nigel and talking about accelerating net zero is how pressing this is. You know, we're talking about companies, we're talking about trees, we're talking about clean energy. It's all about acting now, not in 20 years, not in a decade, now. And I think the important thing to think about is in 20, 30 years, the impact of those actions is going to fall on young people. I think I can still count myself as young. I'm in my early 20s. So, you know, that's going to impact my life, my future. And, you know, I want to see that action taken because it impacts me directly. And, you know, so we've got these young leaders here today and we want to talk about their concerns. What are they worried about? What would they like to see at COP26 towards the end of the year in Glasgow, but also beyond that? Where are we looking? What do we want from that? So first up, I think we're going to come to Juja, as I said, who's a climate delegate to the G7 Youth Summit that's coming up in kind of May, June time. She's also a climate philanthropy manager at Impatience Earth. She's also part of the Future Leaders Network, one of our brilliant network partners. I'm so happy you can join us, Juja. And I just want to kind of start off by asking very directly, what would be on your manifesto? What do you want to see from world leaders? And I'm talking about world leaders and companies, I'm talking about government leaders. So what would you like to see happen? And as I said, right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation. I think the thing that's come up time and time again over the past few months, where in my role as a delegate to the Y7, we've been consulting with lots of young people across the UK, is just inaccessibility to certain spaces or certain experiences that they're looking at when it comes to sort of their own climate journey, specifically around green careers and green jobs. There's a lot of young people that are really interested in pursuing green jobs, whether that's working in the environment sector or whether that's working for companies outside of that sector in different industries, but that really value sustainability and are very environmentally conscious and sort of just not knowing where to start. And so as COP is such a great place for the convening of both political leaders and policymakers, but also business leaders, I think there's a real opportunity to talk about what the future of the green economy looks like specifically for young people when it comes to their career choices, and making sure that we're being fair and just in how those are made accessible for people. So, you know, the environmental sector is a very white space. I think it's 3.5% of people in that sector currently identify as coming from an ethnic minority. So also ensuring that we're not just looking at how people can get into the climate space in terms of their career, but how we do that in a fair way that's inclusive of everybody.
No, and definitely, and it's something that's come up is the green economy, and it's something that's been very present in Biden's recent announcement. He's looking to, you know, build back better, if we're going to use the buzzwords, using the green economy. So what does that look like? What does that green economy look like? Because I think, you know, there's a tendency, and in my mind, as someone who studies humanities, it's a bit harder to me. It's thinking about engineering, it's thinking about that side. So what to you would like an idyllic version of that green economy look like? Where is it spread? How would we support it? How would we work in, you know, education and beyond to support that economy?
Yeah, I totally agree with, I also came from sort of a humanities social science background. And so very much had this thought that climate was not something I could be a part of because I, didn't have STEM skills. And I think it's such an inaccurate assumption on my part, and have learned that actually there are so many ways to be involved in the climate movement from a career lens. And so I think, you mentioned it yourself, there's a really key part of to play in education and awareness. And one of the things we found during our consultation was that 25% of people don't feel informed about climate change, just as a thing. And then amongst those who do feel informed, most of their information is coming from social media, TV, the internet, which I think just shows that there's a real opportunity for educational institutions, whether that's our schools or universities or higher education institutes, to come in and sort of plug that gap and be able to show people that there are lots of different paths into living sort of a environmentally conscious life through both your professional experience and your personal life.
No, definitely. And I think that is it's something I've been thinking about. So I should also add as well, it's completely my fault for not saying that my colleague Harika, who works within the Tortoise Network and the student team, she's going to be in the chat. We want to hear from as many of you as possible. I can see kind of like people are going in the chat, so you can either raise your hand or you can get involved in that way. And also, I'm just going to quickly come to Vishal as well, just to hear his kind of initial thoughts. Hi, Vishal. Let's see if we can hear you. Hello.
Yeah. Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I know you're joining us at a crazy hour, so thank you for that. And just say, so you graduated from the University of South Pacific, you've studied kind of in law, in politics and international affairs, and you're bringing something to us which I think is really interesting and I've not heard about before, is your group, the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, are specifically looking at something to do with the International Courts of Justice and how they can get involved in this as well. So could you just tell us a little bit more about your campaign and what's happening at the moment in Fiji, and then we can kind of talk a little bit more what actually is happening in Fiji, because the conversation today has been very dominated by Russia, China, America, us, and I'd like to kind of diversify that a little bit, as you just said, it's not just about the white people in charge, and I do want to do that in this session.
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe, for that. Yeah, so briefly, our campaign, the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, we're seeking what is called an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Now, an advisory opinion is basically, it's not a litigation case. It's not a case that we bring against another nation. It's just an advisory opinion that the court the court answers a legal question and provides clarification. So what we are seeking is a clarification on what the youth of the Pacific, along with the youth of some of our campaigners from other parts of the world, what we're seeking is a clarification on what are the obligations of states under international law to protect the rights of the human rights of current and future generations. So we see that there is a big nexus between climate change and human rights. And so this needs to be strengthened, and this needs to be clarified. Climate change is a threat now to the human rights of people. So for instance, in the Pacific, we are it's common knowledge now that we're in the front lines of the climate crisis. So we are the first ones who are feeling the brunt of the crisis. And so our rights, our basic human rights, is the right to life, right to movement, right to even sanitation, water, housing. All of these rights, the most basic of them, are under threat for some of the villages, some of the communities that are really at the front lines of this. So what are the obligations of states, both our states and the states of the world, in ensuring that these rights are promoted and protected from the threat of climate change? Now, as any human rights scholar would tell you, if you have a threat to human rights, there needs to be a response to it. And so the same is true for climate change. It's a big threat to our rights, and there must be a response. So we think that the International Court of Justice could provide this clarification on what the obligations of states are. And in doing so, we believe that it will provide what we call a legal catalyst to the climate actions the climate action that's taking elsewhere. So climate negotiations and all of the talk on things like mitigation, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, all of this, it's not where we want, ideally we would want it to be, but hopefully if we have a catalyst that can stir more action, greater action, it would be lovely. And we see that an advisory opinion from the court could potentially provide that catalyst.
No, and that's fascinating. And I think it is interesting that we've got to this part of the day in the summit, and I don't think this has been discussed enough. You know, in my mind, and I think in others, when we're talking about climate change and we're looking at company responsibility and we're looking at some of the issues we've discussed today, then it is still those kind of major players. And I will come back to you, Jude, to talk about the G7 and where that plays into that. But I think that is really fascinating. And to you at the moment, like, how are young people in Fiji and the Pacific Islands and kind of in the South Pacific and South area, southern part of the world, how are they feeling about the moment? Are they looking forward to COP? Are they looking forward to some of these conferences? Are they feeling like it's not worth their time? Is there like confidence in our leaders at the moment? I'm erring to think on no, but I prefer you to tell me that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's a bit of both. There's one group that you would see that are very, very tired of all of these forums and all of these discussions because they don't see anything meaningful coming out of this. But then there is the other group that's the optimistic lot that says that this is the best hope we have, and we just have to keep trying with the mechanisms and the structures and the procedures that we have. And so the hope is that one of the things that we try to do is to ensure that we maintain the climate fight. We try to motivate as many young people to stay involved, to not get disinterested, even though things may not seem progressive, or they might not seem that it's going well, because at the end of the day, we need young people at the table. We need young people to be involved in all of this. So one of our key aims is that we try to ensure that we keep educating young people on all of this, and what we call activating them towards a path of activism, so that we can get as many young people to in their whatever small way they can, to become activists in the communities, in their localities, so that they can stir up change anywhere. So I guess it's a bit of both, I would say, but wouldn't say it's a lost cause. I think it's just a matter of getting people to understand that this is the nature of international politics. This is the nature of how things are going, but we need to keep on fighting. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And so Jude, if I can come back to you a little bit, and I think there's been some comments in the chat about this idea of activism, and clearly something we've been talking about is Greta Thunberg and her protests. So as someone who's kind of more on the side of like the G7 and the diplomatic processes, do you feel confident in those do you feel confident coming into them that there is a space for that? And have you spoken to other young people who go, there is no point, I'm just going to go out in the streets instead? Clearly that's been impacted by COVID, but I'd just be interested to see like how you deal with those two sides of the argument at the moment.
Yeah, I think we have quite a unique position as sort of the Y7, because we're an official engagement group of the G7, and our voice in that process is sort of mandated to be heard, which I think sometimes where there are conferences or convening of policymakers, you know, there is an increased focus on including youth in that conversation, but normally it doesn't go much further than, okay, we spent an hour speaking to young people in the morning of this conference, we've sort of ticked the box and done our job. And so I think it's really thinking through how to make our voice heard at a more substantial level. And so whether that's like, for example, Wales has a Future Generations Commissioner who is part of policy making and understanding how certain policy decisions are going to impact future generations. I think that's a really key role that a lot more local and national sort of political authorities can take up to really include the voice of young people. And I think when it comes to, and especially leading up to COP, we've had lots of different discussions with other sort of youth organizations and youth movements, and we're all having this question of how do we translate what we're talking about into action? Because you can get to the end of COP and every youth organization that's been involved produces a communique or a paper, and it sort of just sits there and you have this stack of papers that all kind of say the same thing, but no one really reads and doesn't actually get translated into action. And so that's something we're thinking about really actively right now, is how do we make sure all these conversations that we're having with young people across the world and these policy recommendations that we're coming up with actually become something that has impact. And for us at Y7, that's not just influencing policy leaders, but that's also making sure once the Y7 summit is over and once the G7 summit is over, making sure that we have some sort of initiative on the back of that to make sure the learnings and the findings that we've discovered along the way are translated into some sort of practice. But I definitely can understand how a lot of people feel extremely frustrated by the process, because I think as a young person, to be brought into a room and sort of finally feel like you have a voice and then realize actually it goes no further than that is incredibly demoralizing. And so I think for all leaders and organizers of conferences like COP to be really thinking about what youth engagement looks like at a sustainable and long-term level, not just, okay, we've brought them in, they've said their piece, and now we can move on.
Yeah, and I think, I guess that plays into that intersectionality point. Beyond young people, clearly, is, you know, it's not just about the tick box. It's actually taking those views into account and taking those policies into account. So I'm curious, and I'm sure that they will come up later. So in terms of the policy recommendations, and you know, you don't have to go into the specifics, but in terms of general policy recommendations, so I might bring in Yelena in a minute, who's a regular Tortoise girl, and I know very passionate about this, but the combination of individual and collective responsibility, I'm talking about like company responsibility and financial responsibility as well as individual, is something that I've been dealing with quite a lot as a young person. There's that kind of guilt that comes with being a young person. So I'd be curious to see, Greg, how does that spread go? Young people, you know, sitting there saying no to straws, which we can kind of go into as on the impacts of that really, but are they actually looking to move towards that economic policy, that collective policy that actually will make a difference? Where does that spread sit at the moment?
Yeah, so this was a question we asked in one of our surveys, and I think the answer was both surprising and not surprising. There was a lot of focus. So we asked the question, what do you think is the most sort of effective way to impact the climate crisis, or like impact it positively? And there was a lot of focus on individual behavioural change, and sort of on individual consumption and what we can do as young people, as individuals, and really less so on participating in local and national politics. And I think that says a lot about what the political ecosystem has traditionally looked like for young people, that they don't see that as a route for effective change, and that's a problem. And it's not to say that if they believe that individual behavioural change is the way they want to impact the climate crisis, that's a bad thing. I am also in the school of thought that there's been a lot of shift and focus on what the individual can do, and that very much is very convenient for the major companies and governments that are the biggest contributors to the climate crisis. And so I think we need to actually be thinking bigger and outside of just climate, and understanding what youth engagement in local and national politics looks like more generally. But for us at the Y7, we were really keen. So we work in negotiations with the delegates from the other Y7 countries, and to come up with policy recommendations. And we were really keen that we didn't just focus on topics that seemed very sort of youth-led. So things like education can sometimes be seen as, okay, that's a topic for youth. And actually we wanted to make sure that our voice was heard across a range of different policies, so both youth-related policies and non-youth related policies. So looking at crisis management, sustainable resource management, climate finance, for example, and making sure that the youth voice is included in every policy area and not just siloed to the policies that are directly related to young people today, because the reality is those policies will affect us, if not today, then tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating as well. I think that's a really interesting like little thing to kind of pull and push on, because it's something that I don't think is heard enough. Is, you know, it's a tendency towards food choices, electricity choices. Like, let's say I'm buying my first car, will you buy an electric car? But actually, you know, all of us will be soon. I've just started, you know, contributing to my pension now that I'm no longer a student. I should be really thinking about the choices where my money is going. I want to be part of the conversations on climate finance. And it's one of those things that we just don't talk about enough. If possible, I want to come to Yelena. I think hopefully she has been pulled through to the front. Just give her a second to come on. Who has written up for us before. We did a great series called Moonshot that maybe my colleague Karika can drop into the chat, or we've got members to get involved and talking about 2030 as a climate goal. So I just wanted to see your view, Gelana. What do you want? What do you want from your leaders? Like, where are you sitting at the moment? And yeah, what do you want? It's a very hard question, I know, but try and pin it down.
Yeah, I think that what Gigi was just saying was so interesting, because there's been a real unsystematic, I should say, double marginalization of both environmental and youth politics, and the voices on both sides of those, or like on both elements of those debates. But I think the thing that interests me most about it is taking more of an intersectional look at this on a national level, because, like we've said, when companies and governments systematically focus on individual behavior change, and I think there is a huge place for consumer behavior change, as you mentioned, the Net Zero 2030 piece that I did last year about food miles and food sustainability. The biggest thing that we as individuals can do is to change our diet, certainly. But the more powerful thing that we can do is unite in collective action, whether that's political activism in a more traditional sense, or the other methods that we've been talking about just now. And I think there's the real shame about all of this, and what we've pointed out is how the current state of affairs really serves to alienate us from both feeling like we can make change beyond ourselves as individuals, but also from the other people in the community who are also seeking to instigate collective action. And ultimately, the people who lose out from that the most are the people who are already marginalized. I mean, we've talked about a bit about gender and things like that, but look at, for instance, ability and disability. I've spoken to many disabled people whilst I was making, I put a link in the chat to a podcast series I made called Liberating Sustainability. And I spoke to many disabled people who feel that they are excluded from discussions on environmental activism. And they also secondarily see themselves portrayed as being a burden because they're unproductive, because they can't take part in the activism that is espoused as being productive, whether that's not relying on plastic straws or not relying on packaged food. Like, those are all things that might be aids, for instance, for certain disabled people. And just focusing on those kind of individual behavioural change items is really damaging, therefore, to their inclusion within sustainability discourses. So yeah, that's kind of where I come at it. I think we need a much more inclusive approach to environmental sustainability at a national level.
Yeah, and I think something that's really interesting with that, right, is we've been talking about the things we've been talking about, right, are things in the short term. The interesting thing when we're talking about this specific discussion about youth is actually we're thinking way in the long term. We're thinking to our future. You have to think less beyond, the viral fad. Something that has happened to the documentary Seaspiracy is that there's been this viral movement towards it. People have been talking about it. People get very excited about sustainable fishing. In 2 weeks, it's going to be something else. And almost in terms of those thoughts and those intersectional thoughts, we have to be thinking quite far ahead in terms of action on climate needs to be much closer towards us. Which is just a really fascinating thing to think about. So if possible, I'm going to come back to Vishal, because I want to ask you something very specifically, which is Australia and where that sits in all of this. Because again, I think, we've been keeping our eyes on the Northern Hemisphere, and I'd like to take it below that. And something that he said that I think is incredibly fascinating is after, as part of the Earth Day conference, was that the future generations will thank us not for what we have promised, but what we deliver. But at the same time, he has much less ambition for carbon pricing and for emission targets in comparison to Biden. So how do we deal with that? Leaders talking very great, they can talking about it, but actually not taking that action. How can we get Scott Morrison to actually listen to young people right now?
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe. I think that's a great question. Australia has been one of the key discussion points in the Pacific here, across CSOs, across NGOs all over, because they term themselves as being part of the Pacific, and they're part of regional forums, they're part of regional discussions, but they don't share essentially the same level of urgency, the same level of commitment as Pacific Island countries do, and we think that the best way forward to get them to get Australian leaders or leaders in general to listen is by maintaining the pressure from inside. I think that's the best way forward. That even though the external pressure is forthcoming, it's there from other states. But I think if young people from from within Australia, they stand up, and they have been. So we've been partnering with a few youth groups in Australia, a few NGOs in Australia. And if they continue to put the pressure on, and I think because ultimately government is bound to listen to the pressures of the public once or now or sometime down the road, even if it's during election time at best. But I think if we continue the pressure and if we keep supporting young people in these countries, that they can maintain the pressure, maintain the momentum in these countries, I think it'll bound to have an impact, and we will reach a breaking point eventually.
I like the optimism of that. I don't think everyone shares that, and I hope I can have some of that optimism, because it does worry me, and I think there is a lesson to be learned in how we take that action and how you put pressure on. But it is a lot of work, and it is a lot of work from a lot of groups, and it revolves around a lot of collective action, which I think was what was so inspiring about the school protests, right? Is that it was global. And so we've actually only got about 5 minutes left, which is very sad, because I think we could keep talking about this for quite a while. So I think if we can kind of finish off, so something that we've been thinking about is what would be on our manifesto, what would be on the Tortoise manifesto for young people coming into the COP and into the future. As you said, Juju, it's not just about COP, it's about beyond that. So I just, if you can really think about what should we be looking at, what should Tortoise be going, right, we should be really drilling into that, we should be researching it, we should be really, looking at that and going, this should be on the manifesto, this is what leaders should have in front of them and actually be reading and caring about. If we start with you, Juju, if that's okay.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to answer the question the way you want, but I don't think it's a particular issue area, because I think as soon as you start prioritizing one issue area over the other, it gets very dangerous, because actually, people are being affected by lots of different climate issues around the world at different levels and different scales. So I wouldn't say, let's put plastic pollution or deforestation on that manifesto over anything else. I think actually it's the lens in which we look at it. And you made an excellent point around intersectionality. And I think just ensuring that we are being inclusive in any policy decision that's coming out of conferences like COP, and making sure that sort of touches every part of the pie, whether that's young people, whether that's people with disabilities, whether that's class. And we found in our survey that class was a huge differentiator in the way that people responded and how they felt they could access certain tools of climate activism, whether that's gender or race or religion, etc. So I think for me, the top line of that manifesto is one of inclusivity and fairness. And when we're talking about a just transition, it means bringing everybody into the conversation. And I think really knowing when to sort of pass the mic to people who are having lived experiences of the climate crisis. And that's in the global south, but it's also in the UK. People in coastal communities or rural communities are facing the consequences of the climate crisis today. And it's making sure that their voices are heard, because just like young people are inheriting these problems tomorrow, there are people who are inheriting these problems today. And so I think that's a really important part of any manifesto on climate.
No, and that's great. And I think, I hope that that's the case, and I hope that lens is taken coming up to it. So I'm going to ask the same question to you, Vishal, and just see what would you look for, and not necessarily COP, but what's the lens that you want the leaders to be looking through, if we phrase it that way rather than specific issues?
Yeah, I would support what Jojo said just now about inclusivity. I think COP this year's COP is termed as, or the theme that they're looking at is calling it the most inclusive COP ever. So I think inclusivity is very important, and particularly at a time like this when we are facing a global pandemic. How do we ensure inclusivity of young people, inclusivity of people who are essentially now as dispersed as ever, because we're not allowed to travel, we're not able to. So many of these young people, many of these disadvantaged and marginalized groups will not be able to travel perhaps to COP because of these restrictions, because of these all of the issues surrounding the pandemic. So how do we ensure inclusivity then? And I guess the lens that we want to look through is as a campaigner with from the Pacific is through the lens of human rights, I guess. How can we ensure that the rights are protected? How does the rights of people, reversing it, how does climate change affect the rights of people? And when we talk about human rights, it's essentially humanizing. It provides this humanizing element to the discussion on climate change, because it brings the lived experiences of people, the losses and the damages that they've suffered. It brings all of that to the fore. And then I think that's very important to discuss all of that when we are taking action on climate change. Essentially, that would be the most or the best motivation forward in coming up to a solution for the climate crisis.
No, I don't think I could have said it better. And I think it's a really important thing to know that COVID has played such a massive role in young people's lives. So this has been absolutely fascinating. It's something that we're going to continue to work on over the year, as we've kind of hinted at that accelerating net zero is something that we're really concerned about. And I might even drop my email into the chat in case that we didn't have time to come to anyone and anyone has any thoughts that they'd like to share. We'd also like to add that if you're not a member already, you can join us for free. You take a 30-day free trial. And if you're a student, even better, you can join us completely for free if you go to our website and search students, which is something that we're really passionate about. It's been a fantastic day. I think we've touched on so many different things. And so we're going to kind of finish off with a little bit of an editorial debrief. Please do let us know what you think. I believe Giles is here and is ready kind of to take over the reins on that. We're not going to take a break in between. We're going to go right into it. But I just want to say huge thanks to Juja and to Vishal for joining us from Fiji and for a great discussion. And I will hand it over to you, Giles.